A routine trip to the bank turns into a humiliating spectacle when a respected black judge is publicly confronted by an overzealous female police officer. In front of stunned onlookers, he is treated with suspicion and disrespect, his authority and dignity challenged in ways he never imagined. But while the officer believes she's in control, she has no idea who she's dealing with. What follows is a powerful lesson in justice, proving that true authority doesn't come from a badge. Don't forget to like and comment where you are from. The unexpected standoff. Judge Malcolm Hayes was a man who had spent his entire life mastering the art of control. Control over his career, his emotions, and most importantly, his reputation. As he stepped out of his sleek black sedan onto the pavement outside City Trust Bank, he adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit and cast a quick glance at his reflection in the car's tinted window. Every detail was immaculate. His shoes polished to a mirror shine, his tie knotted with precision, and his posture straight as an arrow. But beneath the composed exterior, Malcolm carried the weight of responsibility that came with being one of the most respected judges in the state. Today was supposed to be a simple task, a quick visit to handle some financial affairs before heading back to the courthouse. But as he stepped through the revolving glass doors of the bank, he had no idea his entire morning was about to take a humiliating and unexpected turn. The lobby was bustling with activity, a sea of people waiting in lines, filling out forms, and chattering amongst themselves. The air was thick with the aroma of fresh coffee from the complimentary station and the low hum of printers spitting out receipts. Malcolm walked with a purpose, his steps echoing against the marble flooring. As he approached the counter, he nodded politely to a few familiar faces who recognized him from news features and high-profile court cases. Respect followed him wherever he went, or at least that's what he thought. Today, however, would be different. Standing near the exit was Officer Rachel Whitaker. Tall, blonde, and exuding an air of authority that demanded attention, she was well known in the downtown precinct for her rigid adherence to protocol and her no-nonsense attitude. Malcolm had encountered her briefly before, during community events and public hearings, but never in a personal capacity. Today, though, her eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his stomach churn with unease. He wasn't accustomed to being scrutinized outside of the courtroom, and the way she studied him, like a predator sizing up its prey, sent a ripple of irritation through him. He forced himself to ignore it and stepped up to the counter, where a nervous young teller awaited him. "Good morning," Malcolm said with his usual politeness, sliding a folder across the counter. "I need to finalize a transfer." The teller, barely out of his 20s, nodded quickly and scanned the documents, his fingers trembling slightly as he typed into the computer. Malcolm understood the effect he had on people, his presence, his reputation, but today, the tension in the air felt different. And then it happened. "Excuse me, sir." The sharp voice cut through the noise of the bank like a blade. Malcolm turned, his brow furrowing as Officer Whitaker stepped closer, her hand resting on the belt that carried her service weapon. "Can I help you, officer?" he asked, keeping his tone even, though he could already feel the heat rising in his chest. "I need to see some identification," she said firmly, loud enough for several people nearby to pause and glance over. Malcolm blinked, caught off guard. "I just handed my ID to the teller," he replied, gesturing to the counter. "Is there a problem?" Whitaker's lips curled into a tight, humorless smile. "Just a routine check, sir." He felt his jaw tighten. Routine. He had been banking here for years without issue, yet today, under the watchful gaze of an officer with an agenda, he was suddenly suspicious. Malcolm reached into his wallet and produced another form of ID, handing it to her with deliberate calm. "Here." She snatched it with unnecessary force, inspecting it as though she expected to find something incriminating. The silence stretched between them, and Malcolm could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. He could almost hear their thoughts. What did he do? Is he in trouble? His fingers curled into fists at his sides, but he maintained his composure. "What exactly are you doing here today?" Whitaker pressed, tapping his ID with her manicured nails. "I believe my business here is private," Malcolm said coolly, his gaze unwavering. Whitaker arched an eyebrow. "We received a report of suspicious activity." Malcolm's patience was wearing thin. Suspicious in a bank? He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. "Officer, I am Judge Malcolm Hayes, and I assure you, I have nothing to hide." A flicker of realization crossed her face, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "Everyone is subject to security checks, Judge," she said, the emphasis on his title laced with condescension. Malcolm took a step closer, lowering his voice. "I see. And how many others have you checked today?" A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, and an elderly woman in line stepped forward, clutching her cane. "I've been standing here watching you harass this man for no reason," she said firmly. "He's been banking here longer than you've been on the force, young lady." The crowd's murmur grew louder, emboldened by the woman's words. Malcolm didn't speak, letting the moment stretch, watching Whitaker's posture stiffen. With a tight nod, she handed his ID back. "Just doing my job," she muttered, stepping away. Malcolm took his documents, nodding to the elderly woman in gratitude. "Some battles, we fight together," she whispered to him. He smiled faintly, but as he left the bank, the sting of humiliation clung to him. He had won this round, but he knew deep down that this wasn't over. The aftermath. The sun hung lower in the sky as Malcolm Hayes stepped onto the bustling sidewalk outside City Trust Bank. The usual rhythm of the city continued around him, cars honking, pedestrians rushing past, vendors calling out their daily specials, but he felt none of it. His mind was trapped in the echoes of the encounter with Officer Whitaker. The weight of the moment, the humiliation, the sheer absurdity of being treated like a criminal despite his years of service to justice. It gnawed at him, threatening to crack the meticulously constructed armor he had built over the years. He loosened his tie slightly, taking a deep breath to steady himself. But before he could even process the whirlwind of emotions swirling within him, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Malcolm glanced down at the screen. A message from David Carter, his trusted legal aid and longtime friend. "Call me ASAP. It's all over social media." Malcolm sighed, running a hand over his clean-shaven head. Of course it was. He shouldn't have been surprised. In the age of smartphones and viral content, nothing stayed private for long. He tucked his phone away and continued walking toward his car, his movements deliberate but tense. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the stairs from inside the bank had followed him onto the street, sticking to his back like an unwanted burden. As he reached his sedan, a voice called out, "Judge Hayes." Malcolm turned to find a young woman approaching him, phone in hand, recording. She had the determined expression of an amateur journalist hungry for a scoop. "Do you have any comments about what just happened in the bank?" He held up a hand, his voice measured but firm. "No comment," the woman persisted. "People are saying it was racial profiling. Do you agree?" Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I said no comment." He slipped into his car, shutting the door firmly, blocking out the outside world, at least for a moment. He sat in silence for a long beat, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The composed, confident man staring back at him felt distant, like a carefully constructed illusion that was now under threat. He gripped the wheel, knuckles whitening, before exhaling sharply and starting the engine. He had to get ahead of this. Back at his office, the atmosphere was anything but calm. The usually serene halls of the courthouse were abuzz with murmurs, stolen glances, and hushed whispers. Janelle, his sharp and efficient assistant, was already waiting outside his door, her expression a mix of concern and urgency. "Sir," she said, pushing open the door and following him inside. "David's waiting for you on the line." Malcolm nodded and picked up the receiver. "David," he said, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "Malcolm," David's voice came through, tight with urgency. "The video is everywhere, Twitter, Facebook, even the local news picked it up. They're saying it's a clear case of profiling." Malcolm sank into his leather chair, massaging his temple. "And what's the general sentiment?" David hesitated. "Split, as always. Some are calling it blatant racism, others are defending Whitaker, saying she was just doing her job." Malcolm let out a heavy sigh. "Of course," David pressed on. "Look, we need to get ahead of this. Make a statement. Control the narrative." Malcolm leaned back, staring at the ceiling. If I speak now, it'll escalate. If I stay silent, they'll paint their own picture. David chuckled dryly. Welcome to the court of public opinion, my friend. Malcolm considered his options. He had always believed in the power of the law, in letting facts speak for themselves. But this was different. This was about perception. His, Whitaker's, and that of the entire justice system. After a pause, he spoke with measured certainty. Prepare a statement, something professional and composed. I'll address the situation without fanning the flames. Janelle scribbled notes, already anticipating his needs. David sighed in relief. Good. I'll draft something and send it over. Malcolm ended the call, his gaze falling on the window overlooking the city. The streets below were indifferent to his struggles, moving forward without pause. But inside, Malcolm felt the pressure mounting. He knew all too well that perception had the power to destroy even the most carefully built reputations. The next morning, Malcolm walked into the courthouse with his head held high, but the air around him was charged with an almost tangible tension. Reporters had gathered outside, their cameras poised and ready. He kept his face neutral as he walked through the entrance, brushing past their questions with a dignified silence. Inside, his staff stood in clusters, whispering amongst themselves. "Sir," Janelle approached, her tone cautious. "The mayor's office called. They want to discuss the incident." Malcolm rubbed his chin. "I'm sure they do." As he entered his chambers, a wave of exhaustion hit him, but there was no time to indulge in it. His reputation, his career, everything he had worked for, was now under scrutiny. And while the thought of retaliating against Whitaker in court was tempting, he knew better than to make emotional decisions. Later that afternoon, Malcolm sat across from his longtime mentor, Judge Elliot Sanderson. The older man's face was weathered with years of experience, his sharp eyes filled with concern. "You know what this means, don't you, Malcolm?" Sanderson asked, his voice gravelly. Malcolm nodded. "It's not just about me anymore. It's about the judiciary as a whole." Sanderson leaned forward. "Exactly. They'll be watching how you handle this. One misstep, and they'll use it against you." Malcolm exhaled slowly. "I have no intention of giving them that satisfaction." Sanderson studied him for a moment before nodding in approval. "Then tread carefully, son, but don't let them walk over you either." Malcolm's mind raced long after their meeting. He knew he had to navigate this storm strategically, balancing diplomacy with assertiveness. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for every professional who had ever been unfairly questioned, for every black man who had been treated with suspicion despite their achievements. That evening, as he sat in his dimly lit study, staring at his glass of scotch, Vanessa entered quietly, his wife, his rock. She sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his. "You don't have to carry this alone, you know," she whispered. Malcolm smiled faintly. "I know, but I have to face it." Vanessa squeezed his hand. "And you will. Just remember who you are." Malcolm's eyes softened as he nodded. He had fought hard to get where he was, and he wasn't about to let one encounter define him. Tomorrow he would step back into the world with his head high, ready to take control of his own story. The media frenzy. The morning sun barely crept over the skyline when Malcolm's phone erupted with notifications, each ping a reminder that his life was no longer private. Social media was ablaze with opinions, some defending his integrity, others accusing him of pulling the race card. News outlets dissected every moment of the encounter at the bank, with analysts weighing in on both sides. Malcolm sat at his breakfast table sipping black coffee, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through the endless flood of headlines. Judge Hayes, targeted in racial profiling incident. Heroic Officer Whitaker stands her ground. Privilege or prejudice? The debate rages on. Vanessa leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It's out of control," she said, her voice laced with concern. "Everyone's talking about it." Malcolm set his phone down, rubbing his temple. "I know." She moved closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What's your next move?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "David's working on a press strategy. We need to get the truth out there before they spin it into something it's not." Vanessa nodded, but worry lingered in her eyes. "Be careful, Malcolm. People are quick to turn heroes into villains." Later that day, Malcolm arrived at his office, finding David already there with a pile of reports and printed tweets spread across the desk. "Hey, it's worse than we thought," David said without preamble, pushing a laptop toward Malcolm. A viral video of the bank incident was playing on loop, dissected by a popular YouTuber whose tone dripped with skepticism. "This man may be a judge, but that doesn't put him above the law," the commentator said. "Was the officer wrong? Maybe, but wasn't Hayes acting suspiciously defensive?" Malcolm clenched his jaw. "Defensive? I was minding my business." David nodded grimly. "Welcome to the public court, where perception is reality." He tapped on another tab, showing a poll conducted by a local news station. "Look at this. Do you think Judge Hayes was racially profiled? Yes, 47%; no, 42% undecided, 11%. Malcolm sighed. "The numbers are too close." David leaned forward. "We need to get you on camera. Not just a statement, an interview. Show people who you really are." Malcolm exhaled, his fingers drumming on the desk. "And if it backfires?" David smirked. "It won't. You're a judge, Malcolm. You've faced tougher interrogations than a journalist with an agenda." Later that evening, Malcolm found himself in the studio of the Evening Review, a popular news segment known for tackling social issues. The host, Diane Monroe, greeted him with a tight-lipped smile, her polished demeanor giving nothing away. "Judge Hayes, thank you for joining us tonight." Malcolm offered a courteous nod. "Thank you for having me." As the cameras rolled, Diane wasted no time diving in. "Judge Hayes, many people sympathize with your experience at the bank, but others argue that Officer Whitaker was simply doing her job. Do you believe she targeted you because of your race?" Malcolm chose his words carefully. "Diane, I have dedicated my life to upholding the law, to ensuring fairness for all. What happened at the bank was not about following protocol, it was about bias. The kind of bias that assumes guilt before innocence based on appearance alone." Diane leaned forward. "But some critics say you escalated the situation by refusing immediate compliance." Malcolm's gaze was steady. "I complied, Diane. I provided my identification. What I did not do was allow myself to be treated with undue suspicion without cause." The interview continued, touching on systemic issues and Malcolm's personal experiences. By the end, his phone buzzed with supportive messages from colleagues and friends. David, watching from the control room, gave him a thumbs up. The fallout was immediate. Social media tilted in Malcolm's favor, with hashtags like "Respect Judge Hayes" trending. Major media outlets praised his composure and eloquence, while Whitaker's defenders scrambled to shift the narrative. But Malcolm knew the fight was far from over. The next morning, Janelle burst into his office, breathless. "Sir, Officer Whitaker just held a press conference." Malcolm's brow furrowed. "What did she say?" Janelle handed him a tablet, where Whitaker appeared on screen, standing behind a podium, flanked by her lawyer and union representative. "I was simply following protocol," she declared, her voice cool and measured. "In these times, we can't afford to overlook potential threats. It was never about race. It was about ensuring the safety of everyone in that bank." Malcolm clenched his teeth as Whitaker continued. "Judge Hayes is using this incident to push an agenda. I have no regrets about my actions." David groaned from across the room. "She's playing the victim card." Malcolm set the tablet down, a cold determination settling in his chest. "Then it's time to remind everyone what the real issue is." As the day progressed, the courthouse was abuzz with activity. A protest had gathered outside, supporters and detractors clashing in heated debates. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for All" and "Blue Lives Matter" painted a picture of a deeply divided city. Inside, Malcolm prepared for an emergency meeting with the city council, who were now involved due to the widespread attention. The mayor, a pragmatic man named Harold Lyman, greeted him with a firm handshake. "Judge Hayes," he said, "we need to put this fire out before it burns the whole city down." Malcolm nodded. "I'm here to help, Mayor. But let me be clear. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern that needs to be addressed." The meeting dragged on, with council members debating potential reforms and damage control strategies. Malcolm remained composed but firm, insisting that accountability was the only way forward. That evening, as Malcolm returned home, exhaustion seeped into his bones. Vanessa greeted him with a warm hug, whispering, "You're doing the right thing." He kissed her forehead. "I just hope it's enough." The tipping point. The tension in the air was palpable as Malcolm walked into the courthouse the next morning. The usual morning routine, brief greetings from colleagues, the distant chatter of clerks, the rhythmic tapping of keyboards, was overshadowed by the persistent hum of controversy surrounding his name. Reporters had staked out the building entrance, their cameras flashing the moment he stepped out of his car. David was already waiting for him in his office, pacing restlessly. "We need to talk," he said the moment Malcolm entered, shoving a newspaper onto his desk. The bold headline screamed at him, "Law and Order in Crisis. Judge Hayes under fire." Malcolm exhaled slowly, sinking into his chair. "What now?" David sat across from him, flipping through the article. "They're doubling down. Whitaker's supporters are painting you as anti-police. They're saying you're using this incident to push an agenda against law enforcement." Malcolm pinched the bridge of his nose. "I expected that. The question is, what's our next move?" David leaned forward. "We go on the offensive. We release the footage you have of Whitaker's past misconduct. There's no reason to hold back now." Malcolm studied him for a moment before shaking his head. "No, we do this the right way. I've filed the formal complaints. Let the system work." David frowned. "Malcolm, you're still thinking like a judge. This is a public battle now, and perception is everything." Before Malcolm could respond, Janelle knocked and entered, holding her tablet with a concerned look. "Sir, you need to see this. Whitaker just did an exclusive interview." She tapped the screen and Whitaker's face appeared, her voice calm but firm. "I was just doing my job," she said, sitting across from a sympathetic reporter. "We have protocols for a reason. It's unfortunate that Judge Hayes feels targeted, but I acted within the scope of my duties." Malcolm clenched his jaw. She's playing it smart, making herself look reasonable. David threw his hands in the air, "And the public is eating it up. This isn't just about you anymore, Malcolm. It's about what you represent." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before speaking. "Then I guess it's time I remind people exactly what that is." Later that afternoon, Malcolm stood before a podium in a packed press conference, cameras rolling, microphones pointed in his direction. He took a steady breath before addressing the crowd. "I have spent my career fighting for fairness, for justice, and for the truth. The incident at the bank was not about a misunderstanding. It was about bias. Bias that continues to persist in our institutions, despite our best efforts to deny it." A murmur rippled through the press as he continued. "I have full confidence in the legal process and will not engage in public mudslinging. However, I will not allow this conversation to be silenced. If my experience can shine a light on a larger issue, then it is my duty to speak up." David watched from the sidelines, nodding in approval. The speech was controlled, powerful, and dignified, exactly what Malcolm needed. As he left the podium, reporters shouted questions, but he ignored them, heading straight for his car. Janelle met him halfway, her face bright with excitement. "Sir, public sentiment is shifting in our favor. Your speech is trending." Malcolm allowed himself a small smile. "Good. Let's keep it that way." But the battle was far from over. That evening, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He stared at the screen for a moment before opening it. "Back off or regret it." A chill ran down his spine. He showed it to Vanessa, who was sitting beside him on the couch. "They're getting desperate," he muttered. Vanessa frowned, taking the phone from his hand. "You need to tell the police." Malcolm shook his head. "No, that's exactly what they want, to make me afraid." She grabbed his hand tightly. "Malcolm, this isn't just about your reputation anymore. It's about your safety." He sighed, nodding reluctantly. "I'll talk to David in the morning." The next day at the courthouse, David was already waiting with grim news. "I checked out the number that sent you that message," he said, sliding a file across the desk. It's untraceable, could be anyone. Malcolm's expression darkened. That's not what I wanted to hear. David hesitated. Look, Whitaker may not be behind this, but she's definitely not alone in this fight. There are people who don't want this conversation happening. Malcolm exhaled sharply. Then we push harder. I want to meet with the city's civil rights leaders, community organizations, anyone willing to stand with me. David grinned. Now you're talking. Hours later, Malcolm found himself in a packed conference room with influential figures from various communities. Leaders, activists, and legal experts listened intently as he laid out his concerns. This isn't just about me, Malcolm said passionately. It's about accountability. If someone like me, someone with influence, can be treated like this, what does that mean for the average citizen? Applause erupted around the room, and Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he was on the right path. Meanwhile, at the precinct, Officer Whitaker sat across from her lawyer, tension visible in her posture. "They're coming at me from all sides," she muttered. Her lawyer, a grizzled veteran of police union cases, nodded. "Stay the course. The department won't abandon you just yet." Whitaker's eyes darkened. "Hayes won't stop until I'm ruined." The lawyer smirked. "Then make him play defense." The next morning, another headline surfaced, attempting to discredit Malcolm's past. Reports surfaced about an old case he presided over, suggesting bias in favor of minority defendants. David stormed into Malcolm's office, fuming. "They're trying to paint you as an activist judge." Malcolm folded his arms. "Then let's remind them. I'm a fair judge." Janelle poked her head into the office. "Sir, the mayor's office called. They want a meeting." Malcolm nodded. "Let's see what they have to say." As he walked into the mayor's office later that day, he was met with cautious expressions. Mayor Lyman leaned forward, his voice low. "Judge Hayes, we need to cool things down before this city erupts." Malcolm's tone was unwavering. "Then, let's start by addressing the issue head-on." At the breaking point, the mayor's office was filled with an air of restrained urgency, the kind that signaled a crisis spiraling out of control. Malcolm sat across from Mayor Lyman, who leaned forward, steepling his fingers, his expression a careful mask of diplomacy. The tension in the room was palpable, with key aides and legal advisors standing silently along the walls, their gazes darting between Malcolm and the mayor. "Judge Hayes," Lyman began, his voice measured, "we both know the city is in a delicate position right now. Public sentiment is on edge, and this situation with Officer Whitaker is becoming a political powder keg." Malcolm folded his hands on his lap, his gaze unwavering. "With all due respect, Mr. Mayor, this situation is about accountability. It's about ensuring that those who abuse their power don't walk away unscathed." Lyman sighed, rubbing his temples. "No one is saying Whitaker is innocent, but the media frenzy is making it harder for us to manage public perception. What I'm asking, what the city is asking, is for you to consider taking a step back. Let us handle it internally." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Step back? That's exactly the problem. For too long, these issues have been handled internally, and nothing changes. I won't be silent." The mayor exchanged a glance with his chief of staff, a tall woman in a sleek navy suit who nodded subtly. Lyman leaned in, his voice lowering. "Judge, you have my utmost respect. You've done incredible work for this city. But I need you to trust me when I say there are forces at play here bigger than both of us." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly does that mean?" Lyman straightened, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It means let's keep this civil. Let's not let this become a war." Malcolm stood, adjusting his suit jacket. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Mayor, but I think we're long past the point of civility." As he walked out of the office, David was waiting for him in the hallway, reading Malcolm's tense expression immediately. "So what did the mayor say?" Malcolm shook his head, frustration flickering in his eyes. "He wants me to let it go." David scoffed. "Typical. You're not actually considering it, right?" Malcolm shot him a sharp glance. "Of course not," David smirked. "Good, because we just got an anonymous tip. Whitaker's past might be even darker than we thought." Hours later, Malcolm sat in his office, reviewing a file David had handed him. Inside were documents detailing several prior complaints against Whitaker: excessive force, abuse of authority, questionable traffic stops. Most had been buried under administrative loopholes, quietly dismissed with little consequence. Malcolm tapped the edge of the folder thoughtfully. This is systemic, David nodded, and it's exactly what we need to push for her dismissal. Malcolm's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. The caller ID was blocked, but he answered cautiously. Judge Hayes. A distorted voice came through the line, low and menacing. You're making a mistake, Judge. Walk away before it's too late. Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? A click. The line went dead. David watched him closely. Another threat? Malcolm exhaled, setting the phone down. Yeah, they're getting bolder. David's expression darkened. We should take this to the police. Malcolm shook his head. No. If they're scared, it means we're close. David leaned against the desk, his tone serious. Malcolm, we need to be smart. They're not just trying to scare you, they're trying to shut you down. Malcolm met his gaze. Then we fight smarter. The following day, Malcolm and David met with Laura at a discreet cafe downtown. The atmosphere inside was hushed, the scent of roasted coffee hanging in the air. Laura slid a flash drive across the table. Internal Affairs report, she said. I got this from one of my contacts. Whitaker's file is worse than I imagined. Multiple misconduct swept under the rug. Malcolm plugged the drive into his laptop, scrolling through the damning evidence. This is it. This is enough to demand a full review of her career. Laura nodded. But it's going to get ugly. Whitaker isn't the only one who's complicit. Higher-ups let this slide for years. David leaned in. Then we expose them all. Malcolm glanced between them. We go public. Laura hesitated. Are you sure? Once this is out, there's no going back. Malcolm's voice was firm. No going back. Only forward. That night, Malcolm released a statement to the press, presenting the evidence against Whitaker in a calculated, precise manner. The media firestorm reignited, but this time, the narrative shifted. The focus was no longer on Malcolm's experience, it was on the system that had protected Whitaker for so long. Social media exploded with calls for justice, and the pressure on the police department mounted. Across town in her dimly lit apartment, Rachel Whitaker watched the news with a clenched jaw. The images flashing across the screen painted her as a corrupt officer, her face now synonymous with abuse of power. She tossed her remote onto the couch, pacing furiously. Her phone buzzed and she answered without checking the caller ID. What? It's over, Whitaker. Lawson's voice came through, grim and unsympathetic. The department's cutting you loose. Rachel's grip on the phone tightened. No, I'm not going down for this. Lawson sighed. You should have kept your head down, now it's too late. Rachel hung up, her chest heaving. She wasn't going to let this happen. Not without a fight. Back at the courthouse, Malcolm sat in his chambers, exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. Vanessa entered quietly, placing a hand on his back. You okay? He sighed, leaning into her touch. I will be. Eventually. She sat beside him, her eyes filled with concern. They're going to come after you harder now. Malcolm nodded. Let them. The truth is out there now. Vanessa smiled softly. And that's why I love you. You never back down. Malcolm took her hand, squeezing it gently. Not when it matters. The next morning, the headlines read, Whitaker on the brink, police under pressure to clean house. As Malcolm walked into the courthouse, he knew the fight was far from over, but the tide was finally turning. The reckoning. The morning air was thick with anticipation as Malcolm stepped out of his sedan, the courthouse looming before him like a fortress of justice. Journalists clustered outside, their cameras flashing incessantly, capturing every movement as he ascended the stone steps. Reporters shouted questions, their voices blending into a cacophony of urgency. Judge Hayes, do you believe Officer Whitaker should be prosecuted? Sir, are you worried about retaliation? Is this about personal vengeance or justice? Malcolm paused at the top of the stairs, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with an unwavering calm. With a measured breath, he raised a hand, silencing the noise. "This is about accountability," he said, his voice steady but firm, "and I trust the legal process will reveal the truth." He turned and walked inside, the echo of his footsteps lost in the murmur of speculation that followed him. As he entered his chambers, David was already there, his laptop open, a grim look on his face. "You won't believe this," David said, spinning the screen around. Whitaker's lawyer just issued a public statement. Malcolm leaned in, reading the bold headlines. "Officer Whitaker claims targeted harassment by Judge Hayes, a case of abuse of power." Malcolm exhaled sharply, his fingers drumming against the desk. "They're trying to flip the narrative," David nodded. "And it's gaining traction. Some news outlets are already running with it, painting you as a vindictive judge out for revenge." Malcolm sat back, rubbing his temples. "Of course they are." David closed the laptop. "What's the play? Do we respond?" Malcolm's lips pressed into a thin line. "No, we let them talk. The facts are on our side." "But perception matters," David argued. "We need to control the narrative before it spirals." Malcolm glanced at the stacks of legal briefs on his desk. "Then we move faster. If they want to play dirty, we'll drown them in the truth." Across town, in the sterile offices of Whitaker's legal team, Rachel sat with her attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Marcus Klein. The tension in the room was suffocating as Klein flipped through a thick binder of documents. "You're in deep, Rachel," he muttered, tapping a page, "and they've got enough evidence to bury you." Rachel crossed her arms, her face a mask of defiance. "Then we hit back harder." Klein leaned back, assessing her with a skeptical gaze. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just a PR nightmare. You're facing potential criminal charges." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Then make it go away." Klein sighed. "We can delay, maybe create enough doubt to negotiate a deal. But Hayes isn't backing down." Rachel's eyes darkened. "Then we find something on him. Everyone has skeletons." Klein's lips curled into a thin smile. "I'll see what I can dig up." Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, Laura paced in Malcolm's office, frustration simmering beneath her composed exterior. "We need to be careful," she said. "Whitaker's team is relentless. If they get even a shred of dirt on you, they'll exploit it." Malcolm leaned against his desk. "I have nothing to hide," Laura sighed. "That's not the point. It's about perception. They'll twist anything they can." David nodded. "We need to stay ahead of them." Malcolm nodded, determination hardening his features. "Then let's make our next move." The following day, Malcolm stood before a panel of internal investigators, his expression unwavering as they fired questions at him. The lead investigator, a stern-faced woman with piercing blue eyes, folded her hands. "Judge Hayes, do you believe Officer Whitaker deliberately targeted you due to racial bias?" Malcolm held her gaze. "I believe I was treated differently, and her record speaks for itself." The investigator scribbled notes. "Do you have any personal grievances against Officer Whitaker?" Malcolm's voice was steady. "No. My only concern is ensuring fairness and justice." The room fell silent for a moment before the investigator nodded. "Thank you, Judge Hayes, that'll be all." As Malcolm left the room, David caught up with him. "They're playing it cool, but they know Whitaker's in trouble." Malcolm nodded. "Good. Now, let's keep the pressure on." The media firestorm continued to rage as new allegations against Whitaker surfaced. Whistleblowers came forward, detailing instances of misconduct that had been swept under the rug for years. The city's police department found itself in turmoil, forced to respond to mounting public pressure. At home, Malcolm sat in his living room, Vanessa beside him, watching the news unfold. She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You're doing the right thing," she whispered. Malcolm exhaled. "I hope so." Vanessa smiled softly. "I know so." His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was Laura. "We've got movement," she said the moment he answered. "Internal Affairs is recommending Whitaker's suspension pending further investigation." Malcolm's lips curled into a slight smile. "It's a start." But the battle was far from over. That night, as Malcolm left the courthouse, a black SUV idled at the curb. A figure stepped out, Marcus Klein. "Judge Hayes," Klein said smoothly. "Care for a chat?" Malcolm's expression remained impassive. "I have nothing to discuss with you," Klein smirked. "Oh, I think you do. Walk with me." Reluctantly, Malcolm followed him a few steps away from the courthouse entrance. Klein's voice was low, dangerous. "You're making powerful enemies, Your Honor." Malcolm met his gaze evenly. "Justice isn't about making friends." Klein chuckled darkly. "Maybe not, but it's about survival." He slipped a folded piece of paper into Malcolm's pocket and walked away. Malcolm unfolded it cautiously. A single word stared back at him. "Leave." Back in his office, Malcolm studied the note, his mind racing. David leaned against the desk. "They're getting desperate." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "Desperate people make mistakes." Laura entered, her expression grave. "We need to escalate. Whitaker needs to be charged, not just investigated." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Then let's push harder." The breaking point. The tension in the city was palpable. Malcolm stood in his chambers, the weight of the last few weeks pressing heavily on his shoulders. The headlines screamed accusations, support, and controversy in equal measure. The truth was clear, but the battle for justice had become a war of public perception. David entered, a stack of documents in hand, his face a mix of urgency and concern. "We've got a problem," he said, placing the papers on Malcolm's desk. "Whitaker's legal team just filed a motion for wrongful prosecution. They're claiming this entire investigation is a political witch hunt." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Of course they are," he muttered. "And let me guess, they're painting me as a vindictive judge abusing his influence." David nodded. "Exactly. They're pushing the narrative that you're using your position to settle a personal vendetta." Malcolm sighed. "This isn't about personal grievances, it's about accountability." Laura entered, her face grim. "The mayor's office called," she said, closing the door behind her. "They're worried this is going to blow up in their faces. They're asking if you'd consider stepping back." Malcolm's eyes darkened. "Step back? After everything?" Laura shrugged. "Politics, Malcolm. They're trying to save face." Malcolm stood, pacing the length of his office. "No, I won't back down. We have the evidence and the public deserves the truth." David glanced at Laura. "Then we need to hit back harder. We need to show that this isn't just about you. It's about a pattern of systemic issues." Malcolm nodded, his resolve hardening. "Call a press conference. I want the public to know exactly what we're dealing with here." Later that afternoon, Malcolm stood before a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing as he adjusted the microphone. The crowd hushed as he began to speak. "I have dedicated my career to upholding the principles of justice and fairness," Malcolm said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. "The allegations against Officer Whitaker are not personal. They are about ensuring accountability within our law enforcement institutions. No one is above the law, and no one should be subjected to unfair treatment based on their race or status." The reporters fired off questions, but Malcolm remained composed, answering with calculated precision. He refused to let emotions dictate his words. This was about facts, not feelings. One reporter pressed, "Judge Hayes, Officer Whitaker's team claims you're pushing this to further your own political ambitions. How do you respond?" Malcolm's gaze was steady. "I have no political ambitions. My only goal is to see justice served regardless of the consequences." As he stepped away from the podium, David caught up to him, his expression relieved. "That was perfect. You came off as fair, not vengeful." Malcolm offered a tight smile. "Good, because this isn't over." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Rachel Whitaker was pacing in the captain's office, frustration etched into every line of her face. "They're hanging me out to dry," she spat, slamming her fist on the desk. Captain Miller remained calm, watching her with a neutral expression. "Rachel, you made your choices. The evidence is piling up against you." Whitaker scoffed. "You're supposed to have my back." Miller leaned forward. "Not when you're in the wrong." Whitaker clenched her jaw, her mind racing. "If I'm going down, I'm not going alone." Back in Malcolm's office, Janelle knocked softly before entering. "Sir, there's something you need to see." She handed him a sealed envelope marked confidential. Inside were copies of internal memos detailing years of cover-ups involving Whitaker, and not just her. Several high-ranking officials were implicated. Malcolm's eyes scanned the pages, a sense of grim satisfaction settling in. "This goes deeper than I thought," he murmured. Laura peered over his shoulder. "If we release this, it could take down half the department." Malcolm closed the folder. "Then it's time to clean house." That night, as Malcolm sat at home, Vanessa joined him on the couch, handing him a cup of tea. "You're carrying too much," she said softly. Malcolm sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I have to see this through, Ness. If I back down now, what kind of example am I setting?" Vanessa squeezed his hand. "Just don't lose yourself in it, Malcolm. You're fighting for justice, but you're still human." He smiled faintly. "I know. Thanks for reminding me." The phone rang, interrupting the moment. Laura's voice crackled on the other end. "Malcolm, the DA's office wants a meeting. First thing tomorrow." Malcolm's brow furrowed. "Let's be ready." The next morning, in a dimly lit conference room at the district attorney's office, Malcolm sat across from the DA and his team. Tension filled the air as they reviewed the documents he had presented. "This is serious, Judge Hayes," the DA said, flipping through the pages. "You're exposing corruption on a massive scale." Malcolm leaned forward. "Exactly. We can't let this slide. We need to take action." The DA nodded slowly. "We'll convene a grand jury. But understand, this will shake the department to its core." Malcolm's gaze was steady. "Then let's shake it." As the grand jury investigation was announced, the public's support for Malcolm grew stronger. Hashtags like Tong Justice for All and Don't You Stand with Judge Hayes trended across social media, amplifying the call for accountability. But with the momentum came danger. David burst into Malcolm's office later that day, panic etched across his face. "You need to see this." He handed Malcolm his phone. A video had surfaced, grainy footage of Malcolm in a heated exchange with a known real estate developer involved in questionable deals years ago. The narrative? That Malcolm was corrupt, that he had skeletons in his closet. "They're trying to bury you," David said, his voice tight with concern. Malcolm watched the video, his jaw clenched. "I did nothing wrong." Laura entered, arms crossed. "Doesn't matter. They're trying to discredit you." Malcolm exhaled sharply. "Then we fight back harder." Later that evening, Malcolm sat in his study, staring out the window as the city lights twinkled in the distance. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Back off, Hayes. You don't know what you're dealing with." He stared at the words, his resolve only growing stronger. He wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. Justice delivered. The courtroom was packed to capacity, a sea of faces staring intently as the case against Officer Rachel Whitaker reached its climax. Malcolm sat at the plaintiff's table, his fingers steepled in front of him, eyes locked on the judge presiding over the hearing. The months of relentless scrutiny, public pressure, and personal sacrifice had led to this very moment. The weight of expectation hung heavy in the air. "All rise," the bailiff's voice boomed. Everyone stood as Judge Evelyn Calloway entered, her expression stern but fair. She settled into her seat and addressed the courtroom. "We are here today to deliver the final ruling on the misconduct allegations against Officer Rachel Whitaker. After thorough examination of the evidence, it is this court's finding that—" A tense pause filled the room, hearts pounding in anticipation. Malcolm could feel his pulse in his ears, but he remained composed, staring straight ahead. "Officer Whitaker is found guilty of abuse of authority, racial profiling, and falsifying reports." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by hushed murmurs. The weight that Malcolm had carried for so long finally lifted from his shoulders, but his face betrayed no triumph, only quiet relief. Whitaker, seated across from him, clenched her jaw, her face a mask of barely contained fury. The judge continued, her voice unwavering. "Officer Whitaker, you are hereby stripped of your badge and will face further disciplinary actions, including criminal charges to be determined at a later date." Malcolm exhaled slowly, a small nod of acknowledgement to Laura beside him. Justice had been served, but he knew this victory was not just his. It belonged to every person who had ever been doubted, humiliated, or disregarded because of their race. As the courtroom emptied, reporters swarmed Malcolm, microphones shoved in his face, cameras flashing like relentless lightning. "Judge Hayes, how do you feel about the verdict? Will you continue advocating for justice reform? What's next for you?" Malcolm raised his hand, signaling for silence. He looked directly into the cameras and spoke with conviction. "This verdict is a reminder that justice is not just about laws. It's about accountability, fairness, and treating every person with dignity. This fight doesn't end here. Change is a continuous process, and I will continue to fight for it, not just in the courtroom but in our communities." The reporters erupted with more questions, but Malcolm simply walked away, his purpose renewed. Later that evening, Malcolm sat at home, the familiar warmth of his living room offering a stark contrast to the chaos of the outside world. Vanessa placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. He looked at her, exhaustion and gratitude mingling in his eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled. "I know." Their moment of peace was interrupted by a ping on Malcolm's phone. It was an email from the mayor's office. "We need your leadership in police reform efforts. Let's discuss next steps." Malcolm leaned back with a thoughtful smile. The journey wasn't over. It was only evolving. Days later, Malcolm found himself back at the bank where it all started. The same marble floors, the same scent of coffee in the air. But something felt different. This time, the security guard greeted him with a respectful nod. The tellers smiled warmly. As he finalized his transaction, a young law student approached him nervously. "Judge Hayes, I just wanted to say, your story inspired me. I want to be like you someday." Malcolm smiled, shaking the young man's hand. "Then never stop fighting for what's right, and always remember, respect isn't given, it's earned." The young man nodded eagerly, and Malcolm walked out of the bank, his head held high. A message to you. If Malcolm's journey resonated with you, remember this. Standing up for yourself is never easy, but it's always worth it. Injustice exists in many forms, and change only happens when we refuse to stay silent. Now it's your turn. Hit the like button if you believe in standing up for what's right. Share this story with someone who needs inspiration. Leave a comment below. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to fight for your dignity? Let's keep this conversation going. Together we can make a difference. The content is fictitious and does not reflect reality or encourage negative behaviors.